The Jews want a place to worship on the Temple Mount, but the Arabs say, no, it's our Temple Mount. There never was a Jewish temple there in the first place, say the Palestinians. But there is a third party who wants the Temple Mount. Gary Stimmer is here to discuss with me today conspiracy over the Temple Mount.
And J.R., there's good evidence that that third party is acting in collusion with the contestants, or at least the Palestinians, allowing the Palestinians to be the front rank, shall we say. The Palestinians currently are making ridiculous claims. Yasser Arafat, for example, was recently quoted as saying, quote, "Let it be clear the Wailing Wall is not a holy place of the Jews. It's an integral part of the mosque grounds, and we call it Al-Buraq, the name of the horse with which Muhammad ascended to heaven from Jerusalem." And then when asked recently about whether Jerusalem wasn't indeed a holy place to the Jews, he said, no. I'm quoting Yasser Arafat. No, allow me to be precise. They consider Hebron to be holier than Jerusalem. And furthermore, Yasser Arafat said this, until now all the excavations that have been carried out have failed to prove the location of the temple. It's 30 years since they captured the city, and they have not succeeded in giving even one proof as to the location of the temple. And then he goes on to talk about the holy Al-Buraq wall, which is the name of Muhammad's horse. And I can't help reflecting that that is, I think, probably an insult to name the Wailing Wall after Muhammad's horse.
For 3,000 years, the Jews have laid claim to the Temple Mount. From the days of King Solomon, when he built the magnificent temple there, reputed to be one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was destroyed, of course, in 587 BC by the Babylonians, and 70 years or so later, its reconstruction began under Zerubbabel, Nehemiah, and in the days of the first century, in the days of Herod the Great, as he called himself, he built a magnificent temple there. Jesus walked the halls of that temple and taught in Solomon's porch there. That temple was destroyed in AD 70. The history of the Temple Mount is a checkered one. There have been many groups wanting that Temple Mount. Daniel chapter 11, verse 45, the last verse of chapter 11, tells us, "And he," that is the Antichrist, "shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain." There is a third party who wants that Temple Mount. On today's program, we hope to try to identify this third party, Gary.
Third party. And you know, Jesus picked up this same idea, Matthew 24, when he said, 24:15, he said, "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains." We're talking about Judea here. This is, there's no doubt about where Judea is. It's called the contested territories today. And there's no doubt about where the holy place is. The very good archaeological evidence is right up on top of that Temple Mount. I have here from the Guardian, actually it used to be called the Manchester Guardian, a news release from September 25th. And I quote, "The government of Israel is strenuously promoting an idea once unthinkable, entrusting Judaism's holiest site to United Nations control. The acting foreign minister Shlomo Ben-Ami leaves for Cairo today." Now that was the 25th of September, the year 2000, where he is to sound out Egypt's president, Hosni Mubarak, on a proposal to transfer sovereignty of the Temple Mount, also called the Haram al-Sharif, to the supervision of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. Well, J.R., that's sinister news indeed.
Let's go back for a few moments to AD 70 when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and burned Herod's temple to the ground. The Jews continued to live in and around Jerusalem for the next 70 years or so, 60 years. But in AD 132, Bar Kokhba actually started a rebellion against the Romans once again. This, of course, was to be the last rebellion. The Romans handily won. Bar Kokhba was killed, and in AD 132 to 135, the Romans under Hadrian, the general, deported the Jews to the slave markets of the world. And of course, from that day, there were very few Jews, there were some, but very few who actually lived in the Holy Land. Being a somewhat desolate land and the city of Jerusalem renamed Alia Capitolina so that the history of the Jews would be forever lie in oblivion, in around the 7th century, Muhammad rose to power, and he came across the Middle East and with the sword converted the Middle East to Islam, the Mohammedan religion. Muhammad, it is said, some say came to Jerusalem, he was launched from the Temple Mount into heaven. All of that cannot be proven. The Quran has nothing whatsoever to say about it. Jerusalem is never mentioned in the Quran, though Mecca and Medina are. And the interesting thing about it is that in 691 AD, the Mosque of Omar was built on the site of the ancient Jewish temple. That mosque still stands there to this day. 691. So the Arabs laid claim to the Temple Mount under the Islamic religion in the 7th century AD. But in 1099, the Crusaders overran the Holy Land and drove out the infidels, as they were then called. Mm-hmm. And of course, during those days, the Crusader kingdom flourished. The Knights Templar were established. They are called the Poor Knights of the Temple. Templar means temple, French for temple. And they effectively ruled for a couple of hundred years. The history there is most important because they appear to be the third party who want the Temple Mount today.
And that third party, by the way, has ancient roots. J.R. wrote in 1989 a book called Guardians of the Grail. Let me just quote a little brief quotation here, because we're talking about the 12th century, 13th century. Sometime between 1195 and 1216 A.D., Wolfram von Eschenbach published Parsifal, a poem about a quest for the Holy Grail. The poem was no ordinary work. Ravenscroft suggests that it is an initiation document of the highest order. It is a story of Percival, a young man who desired to become one of the knights of King Arthur's Round Table. Through a series of adventures, he was initiated to become the guardian of the Grail. Now, people have talked about the Grail, and the title of your book is The Guardians of the Grail. And people have envisioned it as the cup of Christ, for example. But there's good evidence that it's much more than that.
Yes, you see, the Grail became a metaphor. It was symbolic. Nothing is what it seems to be. The Grail, basically, in my opinion, was the Ark of the Covenant. So, the Jews for 3,000 years have claimed the Temple Mount. Since the 7th century AD, the Muslims have claimed the Temple Mount, but for 1,000 years, from 1099 until today, I guess about 900 years, the group called the Knights Templar have wanted the Temple Mount. Out of that has come the Masonic Lodge, and they claim, to be the Masons, the stonemasons, who originally built the temple for Solomon. They claim roots back to the Phoenician stonemasons, you see, under Hiram. Yeah. And so the Masonic Lodge has a claim to the Temple Mount, and growing out of the Knights Templar with the Masonic Lodge, then there was the Illuminati around 1776, when Adam Weishaupt organized this secret society. Then came Theosophy under Madame Blavatsky and the New Age movement. And these groups lay claim to the Temple Mount today. And of course, coming out of the Knights Templar was not only a religious order, but a political order that still exists today. And I think that is most important, that we understand why some of the things are going on today. Because you see, I think, it is my opinion, that the Jews and the Palestinians are pawns in a game. And the one really behind it is the Knights Templar and the Priory de Zion, the French connection. We'll talk about that in just a few moments when we come back. This appears to be what's going on today. We'll know more about it, of course, as time goes on. We'll be back in just a moment. Don't go away. The poem, Percival, is a story about the quest for the Grail. As Gary said, Wolfram von Eschenbach wrote the poem somewhere around the beginning of the 13th century, from 1195 to 1216. And the poem then became a popular poem in medieval Europe. Wolfram von Eschenbach was one of the Knights Templar. He was well aware of the Knights' quest for the Grail, i.e. the Ark of the Covenant. And so in this poem, Percival, a knight of King Arthur's Round Table, goes off to India to find the Holy Grail. The Grail, of course, is called a stone of light in the poem. It is not a cup in the poem. And to me, the stone of light has to do with the Ten Commandments engraved on the tables of stone in the Ark of the Covenant. And basically, that's where the power comes from that the Knights Templar wanted, for if they could just possess that power, they could rule the world. And so he tells the story of Percival, who goes off to India. Now, in medieval Europe, any country that bordered the Indian Ocean was called India, which included Ethiopia. He goes off to India and finds the ruler is named Prester John. Well, that just happens to be the title of the king of Ethiopia in the Middle Ages. And so obviously Ethiopia is the place. Why were the Knights Templars interested in finding the Grail in Ethiopia? Well, Gary, that takes us back to Lalibela. The Prester John of Ethiopia was kicked out of his throne, and he went to Jerusalem, found a contingent of the Knights Templars. I think that was around 1175, 76 AD. And he said, I was the king of Ethiopia, the Prester John of Ethiopia. My wicked brothers kicked me out of the country. If you'll get an army together and come back with me and overthrow my wicked brother and put me back on the throne, I want you to know we have the Ark of the Covenant down there. And so the Knights Templars go back, overthrow the brother, puts Lalibela back upon the throne as Prester John of Ethiopia. And then a contingent of Knights Templars stay there for the next couple of hundred years. The reason why the Knights Templars were overthrown by the Pope and by the French government, and the Knights Templars were outlawed in France back in the early 14th century, is because they were after the Ark of the Covenant. And the Prester John of Ethiopia wrote a letter to the Pope Clement V, and his friend, the King of France at that time, telling them that the Knights Templars were sinister and that they had plans to capture the Ark and become rulers of the world. And so the Pope and his friend, the King of France, outlawed the Knights Templars, overran their castle in Paris, drove them out of Europe, they thought. But of course, they just went underground. They were a secret society to begin with.
Yeah.
And this then shows the quest for the Ark of the Covenant and the plans for the Temple Mount and rebuilding the temple.
And by the way, J.R., there's very good historical evidence and archaeological evidence in Ethiopia. There are to be found there great artifacts carved by, in the European style by stonemasons who took years to do their work, and there are even the crosses of the Knights Templar to be found carved in stone, done in the ancient past in Ethiopia. So the legend is not just out of somebody's head. There's very good archaeological evidence that this happened, and the Knights Templar, as J.R. mentioned, were forced underground. They were then, and they are now, a sort of combination of a political group. That is, they have political ends, but they also have an underlying theosophy, if you will, a certain system of belief that stems from the dark, the occultic power. And when you combine those two, you have what the Bible describes as this ruling clan who will try to rule the world in the last days.
They also have an economic base. During their years in Jerusalem, they dug up the treasure of Solomon's temple, took it back to Europe, and became the international banking cartel. The central banks of Europe and the world are owned by the Knights Templar. And so actually they have literally bought the world. And so they're the ones who are behind all of the economic, political melees to create world government. The G7, for example, who has been meeting every year for the past 20-something years. Every year they meet, it is a closed session. Nobody is told what they're doing there. Basically, they are preparing for world government. Gary, Christopher Columbus seems to be a part of this mix because he came to Queen Isabella and told her that he could find a new route to India. Well, that takes us back to the poem Percival.
It does.
And his quest for the Grail. When Christopher Columbus sailed west across the Atlantic looking for India, he actually took with him a contingent of Jews who spoke Hebrew, hoping to find people on the other side who spoke Hebrew, and they wanted to find the Ark of the Covenant. Basically, I think that's what he was saying to Isabella. You send me west, I'll bring back the Ark of the Covenant. On his second trip over there, he took Ponce de Leon with him. Ponce de Leon traipsed all over Florida looking for the Fountain of Youth. Well, that's a part of the poem Percival in the quest for the Holy Grail. So this big red cross on the Santa Maria's sail shows us that he was a Knight Templar. Came right out of Portugal where the Knights Templars had fled for safety.
Now, J.R., as you know, there are many Grail societies throughout the world, and they are connected in an underground sort of way. The connections sometimes defy examination. But there are many Grail societies which some say are really one Grail society. It manifests itself in many ways. And they all have the same goal, which is through division and conquering to take over, ultimately, the world. Now, in just a very few seconds here, I'm going to take you back to what we mentioned first, the program. Israel said the United Nations should take over the Temple Mount. That was on the 25th of September, 2000. 3 days later, Ehud Barak agreed that Jerusalem should have twin capitals. 1 day later, on September 29th, Ariel Sharon said, "Over my dead body." Ariel Sharon recognized something. He recognized that the division of Jerusalem has its roots that go all the way back into Europe, really, and the power brokers of Europe who really want to divide and conquer Jerusalem and take it. And the Bible, by the way, says that they will succeed one dark day.
I am told that in May of 1991, Shimon Peres wrote a letter to the Pope. It was delivered by a Frenchman, and this, of course, is a part of the French connection here, of the Knights Templar, the Priori de Zion, promising the Vatican a hegemony over the holy places of Jerusalem, and promising Yasser Arafat a sovereign capital in Jerusalem, and they plan to divide up the Temple Mount. This has been in the making, a conspiracy for it for some years now, during the time, of course, of this peace accords since 1991, 92, 93, the signing of the peace accord until this very day. A KGB agent is in the Balkans, now a Christian, converted to Christ in the last few years, told his pastor, who related this to me personally just in the last few days, that the G7 has already planned who's going to be the president of the new world government and 2 vice presidents. I cannot verify this, I cannot confirm it, we must keep it in the realm of rumor, but he said, and he was an ex-KGB agent, that as in the KGB, he had privy to this information that the G7 have chosen Mikhail Gorbachev to be the president of the world government, the first vice president, Bill Clinton, and the second vice president, Margaret Thatcher. A lot of shenanigans going on behind the scenes, and we know so little, Gary, of what's really going on, and yet from time to time, little bits of information leak out. Watch Jerusalem. That's the key to the future. We'll be back in just a moment.